Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. I'm sure by now that all of you have heard about the racial political fiasco that's been going on in Newbern, Alabama for the last 4 years. Newbern, Alabama, a little town that hasn't had an election since the 1960s. The reason for that is a number of areas, especially in the Deep South, started putting in place these very strange, or should I say peculiar, little rules and all of these things that were done as a way to circumvent the Voting Rights Act. This is the reason why they decided that democracy had to be put on hold in certain areas. We couldn't just have people go to the ballot box and choose their leaders. Why? That would make it democratic or something. The black residents outnumber the white ones more than 2-1, and yet all these decades, those white residents were allowed to appoint mayors instead of actually holding elections. And for people in the Deep South who claim to care so much about democracy, they care so much about making sure that everyone's voice is heard, this hasn't bothered those white residents one bit. These are people who will tell you all the time that democracy is so important, worth fighting for, and yet they didn't even want it where they live. Not surprisingly, this white government deliberately withheld city services and maintenance from black areas, even though black people are the majority of the city's residents. This changed in 2020 when Patrick Braxton, a volunteer firefighter, decided to run for office, and being the only one on the ballot, he won the office of mayor. Sure, it took a hell of a lot longer than it should have for someone to make a move like this, but better late than never, I suppose. Now, the white autocrats of Newbern were caught off guard by this and totally shocked. White privilege is all about giving guaranteed outcomes in the favor of those classified as being of a certain race. Its entire purpose is to prevent and punish any attempts by black people to be competitive, because white privilege cannot exist when there's actual competition. And if white privilege can't exist in the presence of real competition, then what happens to those who have to rely on it? Now, the white autocrats of Newbern, having realized democracy had finally come to their open-air cavern, they responded by literally locking Braxton out of the very office that he himself had won. They refused to hand over the keys to the town hall, and most damningly of all, those white occupiers refused to give Braxton or anyone else access to the town's bank accounts or records. Not long after Mr. Braxton's electoral victory, the white council claimed that they had held what they called a special election, in which, surprise, surprise, they proclaimed that they were the winners and hence still the government. Now, this special election was never announced to the public. Nobody even knew that it had taken place. And state law requires that you cannot do that. It was held in secret behind closed doors. And although this was blatantly illegal and illegitimate, the county and state authorities refused to intervene. Now, if those black residents in Newbern had decided to use their own authority to deal with those criminals and claim, hey, we're the government and we're simply throwing out the trash, then you would have had the sheriff's office suddenly wake up from their meth-induced coma, and the governor would have called in the National Guard, and the state attorney general would have announced indictments against the black residents. Oh, they would have moved. That is, if the black residents had decided to exercise their authority as the local government. Keep in mind, we've seen this not just from the government, but also corporations. One thing that they absolutely do not allow is for black people to call themselves exercising any sort of authority over white people. And for the last 4 years, the sheriff's office in that area refused to enforce the law, as did the Alabama State Attorney General's office and the U.S. Department of Justice. This for the last 4 years. During this time, Mr. Braxton's had to go to court to actually sue for the very office that he had won. That's how you know the laws are not whatever's written on the page. The laws are basically, I'm white and I say so. Well, news has now come that the criminals who were being allowed to occupy the town hall in Newbern have relented, and there's been what's being called a settlement that's been reached in which this white supremacist gang are supposed to end the occupation of the town's government. Braxton will then submit names for Alabama's governor to appoint. The governor is a Republican, by the way. And if the governor fails to make any appointments from the list that she's submitted to by Mr. Braxton, then he will have the ability to call a special election. A real one this time. Now, if what's been going on in Newbern were to happen in any other country, God forbid a black country, what would the reaction of the Fox News and the white right be to that? What would the reaction of the rest of the white media be? They'd all be saying, oh, typical of these black folks, just total corruption, no respect for democracy, where's the rule of law? The very first thing that Mayor Braxton needs to do upon taking office is to have a comprehensive forensic audit performed on the town hall finances. That's why those inbreds were in there destroying records. Because they've been ripping those black residents off for decades now. And the sheriff's office also needs to be investigated too, because they were surely in on it. Keep in mind, we hear a lot about so-called racial set-asides, and these days the white right keeps pushing these weird three-letter acronyms, CRT, DEI, etc. They whine about what they call forced diversity, and that people need to earn their place and not have it just handed to them. Yet when we look to actually see who's forcing themselves into spaces that they haven't earned, the white right's the one we're looking at, not black people. It is the very white conservatives who cry like babies about imaginary discrimination, meanwhile they're steadily carrying out the real thing. Where is Ed Blum at to call out this blatant and illegal racial discrimination in Newbern? Where's all these phony white conservative groups who claim to only want to see people have to get by on merit and not racial set-asides? The same white right-wingers who claim that everyone else is just being handed things are themselves the ultimate recipients of undeserved and unearned rewards. But your white left media isn't making a big deal about this, and neither are the Democrats. You want to talk about a crisis of democracy? Well, here it is. Democrats want to talk about stopping fascism in America? You have an entire town, basically a village, of less than 150 people, and Democrats can't even be bothered to do anything about that. Do you really believe that they care about fascism? Because when it affects black people, they don't say a word. Fascism isn't coming to the United States, it's always been here. Go back and watch my video about George Washington, the first fascist, if you want the rundown on that one. The Democrats don't care about fascism, they only care about themselves. Now, as good as the news has been for the folks of Newbern, the matter isn't settled. The federal judge handling this case still has to sign off on this so-called settlement. That judge, Christy DuBose, was appointed by W back in 2005. Keep in mind, this is the same judge who just over a month ago denied Braxton's request for a special election to be conducted in November. This Judge DuBose, she totally ignored that the so-called election that the White Council claimed to have held was blatantly illegal and illegitimate. She conceded the obvious, that Braxton's lawsuit would succeed, which means she concedes that the white criminal figures in Newbern were breaking the law, and yet she's done everything she can to stall the process and drag it out. Why is that? She's been trying to keep this lawsuit in her courtroom because her job is to make sure the status quo remains frozen as is. This is what white privilege is all about, to try to freeze the world into this anti-black paradigm. And speaking of people who ain't said boo, the feds should have been all over this one. Merrick Garland and Kristen Clark should have descended on Alabama like the wrath of God. Joe Biden had no problem sending his Solicitor General to the Supreme Court to argue on behalf of the police having immunity from having to issue Miranda warnings, and yet at the same time ain't said a word about this. They haven't moved a muscle in 3 generations, though they certainly wouldn't be in a hurry now. So much for wanting to fight fascism, huh? Now for the fools who keep asking me about voting, listen up, stupid. Voting does no good if the person running is not talking about empowering you. Voting for national office makes very little sense for black people, but local and occasionally state races do make sense, but even those become pointless if the people running for mayor or city council aren't talking about you. Just look at Stephen Reed or Karen Bass, 2 black mayors who don't even talk about black people. And Stephen Reed was so silly, he got caught bragging that he doesn't even need black people's votes. Even though he got caught on a secret recording saying all this stuff, you hardly needed to have actual audio for it. All you had to do was look to see the man's policy stances and the fact that he clearly keeps black people at arm's length. He has no respect for black people. And yet this guy is a mayor in Alabama. How is it that you got all of these inbred racists down there who think they can pull stuff like this and get away with it? It's because they have a ready phalanx of bootlicks like Stephen Reed who'll go ahead and tell black folks that they don't need black people's votes, and they're not doing anything to fight white supremacy. They're trying to find a comfortable place under it. The bad guys know this. But for all of you vote no matter what clowns out there, are we supposed to go and get recordings of all the Negroes who are running for office? Or do we show some common sense and look not at what they say, but at what they do? Don't listen to slogans or buzzwords. Listen to see whether they say black or whether they immediately try to water it down and say minorities or people of color. Now, obviously, if you have the local clan in charge of your entire town, then of course voting can have a dramatic effect, and that's fine. But ultimately, the goal is not and cannot merely be to have black faces in high places. That's one of the lessons that we all should have learned from the civil rights era. Now that the town of Newbern has a shot at actually having democracy, a government of, for, and by the people, they have to now show that they can address the lack of services that the white misleaders subjected the black residents to. The need to vote for Braxton was readily evident. That much was obvious. But it won't be until he actually formally takes office that he and his council will finally be able to prove whether they should continue to receive those black votes. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Matthew Liggins, Richard Allen Lovell, Jimmy Whitfield, Suleiman Alaji, and Sean. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.